All right, ma'am, we're recording. I just want to welcome you once again. This is Representative Betsy Fogle, a brand new representative. We are going to get a little bit of a different presentation here. Normally our presentations are what life is like for somebody that's serving, but not only are you serving, but you're learning while you're serving. You're brand new right now, so welcome aboard in the House of Representatives. Before we get started, you are, of course, a Democrat. We'll talk about that later, and you represent the Missouri House District 135. What is that district encompass? Can you go ahead and let us know?
Yeah, so the 135th district is pretty much Central East Springfield. So for those of you who are familiar with the community, I have pretty much national, south to Sunset, east to a little past 65, and then north to Kearney. So where you guys are sitting, I'm guessing, is just slightly west of the boundary of my district.
Okay, and ma'am, can you lay out for us, we had talked about this before, how did you get into what you're doing now? What is your job like? And of course, why do you identify with the political party that you identify with?
Yeah, so lots of questions in there. So I'll start by telling you guys a little bit more about myself. So my name's Betsy. I've worked in public health my whole professional career. So I worked at a place called Jordan Valley Community Health Center, which is a federally qualified health center. We provide medical, dental, and behavioral health services to low-income residents of the Springfield and Southwest Missouri area. Jordan Valley is located adjacent to OTC. I'm sure you guys walk past it and drive past it all the time. But that was kind of the experience that first got me interested in policy. My undergraduate and master's degrees are both in the field of sociology. So studied people, how people interact, social inequality, and then, kind of lived that experience in a health center, watching people try to access services, but not have insurance and not have access to transportation, not have enough money to put food on their table for their families. And so that was kind of the wheel started to turn, and I was very interested in policy and in crafting policy. To be honest with you guys, I never in a million years saw myself as a candidate or somebody who would run for office. But about 2 years ago, Representative Crystal Quaid, who's another Democrat from Southwest Missouri, took me out to coffee and said that they were looking for a candidate to run in the 135th. And she had heard that I worked in public health and that I was interested in the policy side of things. And so I thought about it for about 5 minutes and decided, hey, there's no better way to impact change at the local level or state level than by being in this building in the Capitol and crafting that legislation. So campaigned very hard for the following few years, knocking thousands of doors and making thousands of phone calls. When COVID hit, we had to completely transition to a virtual platform. So we didn't knock a single door after March because we wanted to keep everybody safe and sound. So learned how to run a virtual campaign very quickly. And my race was very close. So we ended up on election night when everybody else was celebrating or crying because they hadn't won. I didn't know the results of my election. It was too close to call. So there had to be a manual recount of all of the 18,000 plus votes in the district, which took about 7 days. And I ended up winning my district by 76 votes. So it was not only the one district in the whole state.
Sorry for interrupting. By how many votes?
76.
76.
Yes. So if you guys take away one thing from this talk, I always want people to hear that number, because to me that shows the importance of getting involved and going to the ballot box and having your voice heard. Because 76 people decided to get up that morning and go cast a ballot, we now have a second Democrat in the lower half of the state, which for a lot of people is really important. And, out of a district of 36,000 people, the fact that 30 or 76 made up the difference, I think is pretty amazing. So we were the only district in the whole state to flip from red to blue or from blue to red. And again, I can attribute that all to the hard work that my team did and the countless hours that we spent connecting with voters. So that led me here. I am on week, maybe 7 of being an elected official, working in Jeff City. I am a Democrat. I already talked about this a little bit before, but we only have 2 in the lower half of the state. So we have obviously substantial Democratic representation in St. Louis and Kansas City, kind of the more urban areas of the state. But then below that, we only have myself and Representative Quaid. I think your final question was, why do I identify as a Democrat? And I would just say that I believe in making the community better, not only for myself, but for my neighbors. And the Democratic ideology very much fits that mold. I think, I want to live in a state where everybody feels welcomed and everybody feels included. I want to live in a state where we have strong schools and my neighbors have access to healthcare. And I want to live in a state that leads by example, is kind and compassionate, and attracts people who don't look like or think like me. And I think that, in my opinion, very much aligns with Democratic ideology and why I identify and ran as a Democrat. So that's kind of a little bit about me. I'm sorry if that was too much talking at you, but I think that answered all your questions.
Sure. Can I have you expound a little bit more? What is your day-to-day like? As I imagine every day is different, but what is your day-to-day like?
Yes. So for those of you who don't know, and I'm sorry if you all already know this, but so I work in the Capitol in Jeff City. When I was out knocking doors talking about being a state representative, a lot of people asked me, well, are you excited to move to Washington, D.C.? Or thought that I worked in the City Hall building in Springfield, but I do work in Jeff City. Our legislative session runs from January through May. So a typical week looks like I drive up early Monday morning and then go home late Thursday night, and then I'm back in district for the weekends. And that will happen through May, and then pretty much May through January, I'm in district unless we get called back for special session. So that's kind of what the calendar looks like. My day-to-day, my days typically start around 8 o'clock in the morning. And I have the privilege of serving on the budget committee, which is a lot of work. I'll show you guys my budget books. So that's about 1/4 of the materials I've read over the last 3 weeks. So we start budget really early in the morning, and then session goes in at 10 o'clock. So that's when all of the members of the House meet on the floor in our chamber, and we vote on legislation as a body. And then we break up into subcommittee or into committees. Like I said, I serve on the budget committee and also a committee called Emerging Issues, which has a very diverse group of legislation that moves through. We've heard things from education to tax policy. There's a lot of different areas that committee gets to vote on. And then my evenings pretty much look like going home with my roommates who are both freshman legislators, and we talk about legislation that we saw that day, legislation that we're going to see the following day, and just doing everything we can to keep up with the fast pace of the building.
Now, your background, as you said a moment ago, is in public health, right? Mm-hmm. Usually the background for a legislator like yourself is a lawyer or in the legal field. Just a personal question here. Do you know if any of your coworkers have a similar or comparable background in public health, or are you it?
I would say, I think I'm the only person with a public health specific background. There is another freshman in my Democratic caucus who was an ICU nurse, so had clinical experience in the medical field. But of course, that's a very different skill set than working in public health. And I think to date, I'm the only person who has that background.
So that makes you uniquely qualified to talk about the reason why you're Zooming today rather than being here in person is, of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we got lots of questions from students regarding your perspective on that. Like this question from Adam Burkhardt, one of my students. He asked, how could the governor, because you have criticized the governor, how could the governor have better handled the COVID-19 crisis better?
So this, I'll tell you, we have spent a lot of time in this building talking about this exact issue. As somebody whose background is in healthcare, I'm always going to approach things from a medical, clinical, science-based perspective. I called very early on, as did a lot of people, for a statewide mask mandate. I believe that masks are an effective way of, one of the layers of being an effective way of curbing the pandemic that we're seeing. I also very much believe in local public control of making sure that we have orders in place when we do have a public health emergency. What we're seeing right now moving through a lot of our committees is legislation that would make it harder for municipalities to make decisions when a public health order happens. So for example, we have legislation moving that would prohibit gyms to be closed during a public health order. And we have legislation moving that would prohibit any store that sells guns, gun ranges to be closed, as well as religious organizations. So to me, what those pieces of legislation do is strip local control and make it harder for the people who are trying to keep us safe to do so. So to kind of wrap it up, I would just say, I understand completely that small businesses struggle and that people struggled, and we need to do a better job as a state of helping out people who have suffered over the last 12 months. But I also believe that every life is valuable and that we have to make sure that we're doing our part in protecting one another. And a mask, to me, is one of those ways that we could have done so. There are, of course, a lot of really great debate and questions about the importance of having kiddos in schools. You know, we've seen different guidance from the CDC and from the state about should kiddos be in schools? Is it safe? Is it not safe? What are kiddos missing out on when they're not in schools? And there's valuable points on all sides. But, you know, as we all know, this was an unprecedented situation. And in my mind, that's when we should listen to the health experts and the doctors in the field that are telling us the facts about the pandemic.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. We need to circle back to that here in a little bit because you are homeschooled yourself, and we had several questions about that. So we're going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to stay on the pandemic for a moment. One thing we've learned about, Representative, in class is we've learned about federalism, the different levels of government, what should be in charge of what. And why do you believe that Governor Parsons letting local governments decide their own precautions for COVID-19 was unacceptable?
Sorry, was there a question in there or just to speak to that?
Yeah, there's a question from student Lexi Jacobs. She had asked why you believe Parsons letting local governments decide their own precautions for COVID-19 was unacceptable.
So that, you know, this is one of those things that's a very complex situation. And, you know, we all argue for local control until it's something that we don't like. And then oftentimes we say, no, that should be state control. And I'm sure I'm no different. I do believe in Greene County, I'll speak to that specifically. We were very lucky with a public health director. For those of you who don't know Clay Goddard, he's been amazing over the last year. I also fully recognize that our local public health agencies are underfunded. This is something that we heard in budget this week, so I think is very pertinent. We are 51 out of 51, including the District of Columbia, in per capita spending in public health in the state of Missouri. So in my mind, what we did is we asked local public health agencies who were under-resourced and underfunded to make these very critical decisions for their communities without supporting them sufficiently from the state level. Again, I preface all this to say that I do not envy anybody who had to make a decision about what to leave open, what to close, what jobs were considered essential, what were not, because I understand that behind every job is a person and behind every job is someone trying to provide for their family and themselves. So I preface all this to say I understand that it was a very difficult time. But when I'm critical, or when I've been critical in the past or questioned our governor about our response to COVID-19, it comes from a place of making sure that we have the correct resources in line and that we're listening to the experts in their field. I think another great example locally, for those of you who haven't followed Steve Edwards, who's the CEO of Cox, he has also been a very vocal leader in a statewide mask mandate and putting precautions in place to make sure hospitals don't get overcrowded, because last October, November, we were seeing a surge of people that were in our hospital beds. We were having to divert people away from care because there weren't enough staff to take care of them. And to me, that's very concerning and something that we could have done to prevent that from, I think, the medical perspective would be a statewide mask mandate.
Svetlana Ruskovich, another student, she asked, with your prior education in public health, what can we do to hurry the reopening of states and the safety restrictions? People want to feel normal again. This pandemic is leading to an increase of mental health disorders.
Absolutely. So I want to clarify that question really fast because I think it asks my education in public health. And I just want to make sure I'm being transparent. So my background or my educational experience, again, was in the field of sociology. My professional background was about 6.5 years in the field of public health. So I just want to make sure I clarified that. So to me, again, looking at it from a medical perspective, a public health perspective, we need to get vaccines in arms and we need to be educating the public on the importance of vaccines. So I'll give an anecdotal story from my former employer. When I worked in healthcare, there were a lot of people who didn't feel well equipped to get a vaccine in their arm because they didn't know the long-term consequences. The technology or the information was so new, people were fearful to get it. You know, we had heard a lot of things about, am I gonna, and some of it was kind of silly, right? But am I gonna grow a third arm, or am I going to be able to carry children later on in life? And those are very valuable questions. And I think we need to do a good job of making sure people feel educated and people have the opportunity to ask questions. But to me, kind of at the crux of all of this is getting immunizations in people's arms and making sure that people are safe to re-engage. And to the point about mental health, we've seen some very scary statistics about kiddos not being in schools and the increased suicide rates. I'll just speak personally, like when I've been home for extended periods of time by myself, not interacting with anybody, I'm single, I live alone, it does take a toll. You get lonely and you get in your head when you're just sitting at home by yourself for hours on end with nothing to do. So I fully support reopening the state as quickly as possible. I also just fully support doing it in a way that our public health experts are advising.
Just to follow up on that, because you talked about vaccinations, I assume as a state rep, you have been vaccinated?
So I have been vaccinated, not in my role as a state rep, but I was an employee of Jordan Valley Public Health, so I got my vaccine through there.
How was it? Would you like to share the experience of getting vaccinated, side effects, etc.?
Absolutely. So I've been very transparent about this because I think it's important. So I got my first vaccine. We again, being in public health, we got them pretty early on. No side effects other than I felt like I worked out one arm at the gym a little too hard. I got my second vaccine, and I will be honest, I ran a 103 fever for about 36 hours. Threw up about 20 times, didn't leave bed for about 2 days. But I kept telling myself, your body's preparing for a battle. That's the point of a vaccine. And I would much rather feel bad for 36 hours than have long-term cardiovascular effects or long-term side effects from actually having COVID-19. So it's definitely a worth it trade, but I felt really bad for about 2 days.
I heard that booster, that second shot, that's pretty rough for a lot of people anyways.
Yeah. And for those in the room, I have heard that it's worse for younger people. This is of course anecdotal, but a lot of my colleagues who are similar in age to me, I'm 31, we seemed to feel worse than some of our colleagues who were in their older years. So just a heads up, I always tell people maybe schedule a light schedule the day after you plan to get your second one when it's your turn.
Representative, we got a great question from Taylor Kupta, because you had mentioned small business a moment ago. Moving forward, what are your plans for small business in Missouri? Due to COVID, a lot of people lost their jobs. Will employment be an issue?
Yes. So I think what we see when we look at unemployment rates is, of course, over the early spring and summer last year, unemployment, of course, increased, and we saw record numbers of people filing for unemployment. And then it kind of leveled off, and now we're in a much better situation than we were. I think I'll give a few examples. There are places in Springfield that my heart is absolutely broken that they've had to close their doors over the last few months, restaurants, bars, those types of things, that weren't able to sustain the losses. I think, again, when we talk about public health emergencies and public health orders, our role of the government is in going in and supplementing or providing aid and assistance to the individuals who've been impacted. And I think we've seen several stimulus packages come through from the federal government, and I know we're anticipating more. And I think getting those dollars into the hands of the people that need it and doing the things that we can to support small businesses is very important. Springfield at large, and then my district specifically, we have a lot of small businesses, a lot of people who that's how they make their living. And that adds so much value to a place like Springfield. I don't want to live in a place that the only restaurant is a Chili's. It's not that I dislike Chili's, but I love going to places like Bambino's, and I love going to Cherry Picker, which is in my district. And I love those places that you don't get anywhere else in the state or anywhere else in the country. And our role, in my opinion, is to support those small businesses, of course, while maintaining that public health perspective as well.
Let's move on from the pandemic to a few other issues that students have written in on that you have been outspoken about. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you support a $15 minimum wage. Is that correct?
Yeah, so to be honest, that's not something I necessarily campaigned on, since it's it has been a federal initiative, I'll say it that way. I very much focus my campaign on things that I can impact at the state level. So I don't think that I've publicly talked about it one way or the other. But I do acknowledge that there's a problem in our society if you can work full time, 40 hours a week, and make less than the federal poverty limit. That is setting our families up for failure, and an acknowledgement, and I acknowledge that that's a flaw in the system.
Obviously last year was a rough year in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that I'm afraid we're moving on too quickly from is social justice. This is a question from Kenzie Walker, who asks, do you agree to quote unquote defund the police? and agree with what happened this past summer to other places around the country with the riots and burning of buildings by the Black Lives Matter movement?
So, I'm an elected official who's always going to be very transparent, and that will maybe serve me well or maybe not serve me well. But I'll speak very openly about this with you guys. I think even the way that we frame questions is important. So the term defund the police has been used, in my opinion, as an inflammatory way of saying that we have a problem with the criminal justice system. I do believe that we have problems within our criminal justice system, and I could send you guys a lot of statistics and research to back that up. I do not believe in abolishing the police department. I think Springfield Police Department is a key partner in keeping our community safe, and they need the resources at their disposal to do so. I also believe that places who have employed social workers into their police departments have seen that be much more of a benefit than just employing more police officers, because oftentimes what police officers are dealing with are mental health disorders, substance abuse disorders, and they're not prepared for that. That would be like, sending me as somebody who has a background in sociology in to do a clinical diagnosis of somebody who is having a psychotic breakdown. I'm not prepared for that. Our police officers are not prepared for that. So to me, when we talk about defunding the police, I do not believe in taking dollars that keep us safe from our police department, but I do believe in making sure that they have the resources that they need to be successful. There is a time and a place to have police officers, or as we call them in the building, peace officers in our community. When I have someone, this has happened to me, I've had someone try to break into my home. I like having the security of calling 911. I also know that I am coming from a place of privilege, that I'm a white female that lives in Springfield, Missouri, and I don't have the struggles in my background that other people in our state have with the police, with the law enforcement. So to me, the answer isn't, should we take money from the police department? The answer is, how do we look at the criminal justice system at large and correctly resource the officers who are tasked with keeping us safe? And I think maybe I see a hand up in the corner. I don't know if we're doing informal questions, but.
Yeah, go ahead. This is Alexa, go ahead.
Sounds good. I was just wondering if you could send that statistical value to Mr. Crocker.
Yeah.
Just about the prisons.
Yeah, email it to me and I'll happily share it. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. Some documentaries as well that I've watched in the past that have kind of helped me form my opinion. I'd be happy to share this.
Awesome, thank you.
We got a question from Aaron Wilson, who says on your website, you state that you will work towards creating and attracting clean energy jobs in the Ozarks. What do these clean energy jobs look like?
So yesterday, do you guys know what the Grain Belt Express is? Do you know a lot about solar energy and energy? I don't want to bore anybody, but an example would be yesterday we had a debate about eminent domain. So eminent domain means, to put it simply, that the government has the ability to go in and take private property for greater good, for larger good. So you see this sometimes with like nuclear power plants or things that are necessary and critical infrastructure for the state, but we need to go in and take private property in order to build it. So the debate yesterday that we had was regarding eminent domain in regards to the Grain Belt Express that would bring solar energy into the state. And there's a lot of conversation about, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? It would create jobs. It would create 6% of that energy would come to the state of Missouri. But solar energy is one of those hot topics that people on both sides of the aisle have very different perspectives on. Not everybody, but it seems to be that it's kind of one of those partisan debates. But I voted against the amendment, or against the bill that would prohibit us from bringing in that clean energy. I think it's good for the economy. I think what we've seen over the last 2 weeks, especially in Texas, I'm sure you guys followed that story. I mean, we had neighbors in the United States that were sitting there without power for days on end. And one of the ways to rectify that would be to have clean energy and solar energy in our state. So I was one of the few people who voted in support of that. Ultimately, the bill failed because so many people on the other side of the aisle disagree with us on it. But when I talk about bringing clean jobs, bringing clean energy, those are kind of the things that I think are next on the legislative side is how do we get those companies, how do we get that energy to our state?
Ma'am, I got a question from, well, let's circle back to the homeschooling aspect. There's a question from Leah Pope asked about that. She asked, for homeschoolers, since you mentioned you were homeschooled, do you plan on making any environment or funds for only homeschoolers to make them more involved in learning and make learning more efficient? What are your plans on homeschooling, if any?
So I don't know, maybe I misspoke. I was not homeschooled. So I went to Springfield Public Schools. I went to Sunshine Elementary, Jarrett Middle School, Parkview High School. So proud product, spent my whole K-12 education in the public school district. So I don't know if I said something earlier that maybe contradicted that, but I did go to public schools. I was not homeschooled. So I don't know if that changes the question, but I will share in terms of, we have a lot of conversation up here. Right now, the debate is primarily focused on charter schools. So for those of you who don't know what charter schools are public schools that are governed by non-local boards that exist within the Kansas City and Springfield Public School District. Those are the only two places in the state that they currently exist. There's a lot of movement from some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to extend those charter schools statewide, to change funding mechanisms for charter schools. We're also talking a lot about voucher programs where kiddos can, get paid or take dollars from the public school district to go to other schools within their community. I am pro public schools. Like I said, proud graduate of the public school district in Springfield. We have the largest public school district in the whole state. I think we have a very good K through 12 program. We have great magnet schools in our community. And of course, my job as representative of the 135th district is to take the needs of the people in my district to this building that I work in every day. So to me, public education is critically important for the well-being and success of our community. I think Springfield Public Schools does a good job. I want to do a great job. And I think that there are conversations that we can have about how to be a better school district, but that does not, in my mind, include taking public dollars and allocating them to other types of schools.
Question from Ivy Johnson. Another issue addressed on your website is that non-discrimination has been trying to be passed for the last 2 decades. Do you believe that allowing protection to the LGBTQ community should be welcomed in Missouri, and nobody should fear losing their job or their house due to who they love or who they associate as? On that topic, do you believe that if you identify as one, you should be allowed to use the restroom that you identify with rather than the sex you were born as? Do you think that's safe for children and it's not just easy access for predators?
So I will answer this question in 2 ways. There has not been any factual justification that that places that have bathrooms that allow individuals of different presenting sexes that has been abused and that children are unsafe. I think that is a misconception, and I stand by that. Personally, I believe that we should have, my favorite type of bathroom to use is a bathroom that is a unisex bathroom, or a bathroom that, that is just a family bathroom. So there's one stall, you go in it and you leave. Personally, I don't want anyone to listen to what I'm doing in the bathroom, regardless of your gender. But I do, to the larger point of the question, I do very much believe in the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act. I think, like I said earlier, I want to live in a state where everybody feels safe and everybody feels protected. And that's something that my office here hears all the time. Are people reaching out who are fearful of this fact that in the state you can be kicked out of your home or fired for being gay. Of course, some of that has changed at the federal level with the Supreme Court ruling last year. But I know we've had corporations who have not wanted to relocate to Missouri, large corporations, because we are on the NAACP's no travel ban because of some of these lack of protections that we have for our neighbors. And so to me, that is an issue that has been brought up every single year. I think for the last 21, 22 years, it's been filed this year. A Republican actually filed the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act. And I look forward to seeing what happens with that legislation this session.
We got a question from Peyton Kiesling, wants to talk about service industries, how they lost a lot. On my end, they've lost a lot of jobs. According to you, if jobs are one of the 3 pillars of a strong community, what practical plans do you have to decrease unemployment in Missouri? So
again, I think it's always important for me to delineate between, what happens at the state level, what happens at the federal level, and what happens at the local level. There's a lot of support that is provided at the federal level that has nothing to do with me or my office. At the state level, I mean, is this question, and I don't know if this individual is in the room, is this specific to post-COVID or COVID or just the service industry in general?
Well, since it said it's lost a lot of money, I'm just going to say that, and the student is not in the room, but I'm going to say that it's related to the pandemic.
Okay. So again, I'll go back to we need to open up as safely as possible and as quickly as possible. I miss going out to bars. I miss going out to restaurants. I miss going to the movies. I was just thinking this on Sunday in Springfield. I was back in district. It was a rainy day. In past life, I would have gone to a movie and watched something, and I would have really enjoyed it. I miss being social and I miss being out. I know we all do on this call. To the question, it is, jobs are of course an essential part of the community. In my mind, I'm always going to come at questions from a public health perspective, because I think our health and our lives and our security are all very important, knowing that that ties into jobs as well. Everything's interconnected, right? We kind of have Maslow's hierarchy of needs and everything's interconnected. So to me, at the state level, what we can do is I'll go back to it, get vaccines in arms as quickly as possible. We had some hiccups early on with the vaccine rollout plan. I'm sure you guys saw that. It's been in the media quite a bit. I think the last week or two, we've gone from being 50th in the state or in all the states for getting vaccines in arms, and jumped, I think, 13 spots maybe. So we need to continue on that path, because for me, the number one most critical thing about getting places back open is getting those vaccines in the arm.
Follow-up question to that, this isn't relevant to anything, but once we are quote unquote past the pandemic, what's the first thing you're doing for fun?
Oh gosh. I really look forward to going dancing, which is maybe not the right answer to say here, but I love dancing. I love going to a wedding and dancing. I have some family members getting married in the later part of this calendar year, and I just really hope that we're living in a world where we get to have a band and dance. So that is what I'm looking forward to.
I have a 3 and a 5-year-old, and I asked them, what's the first thing you want to do when we're quote unquote past the pandemic? And they were like, bowling. They both wanted to go bowling. That's the first thing they want to do, bowl.
That's a good one.
I got a question from Gage Gunter that's specific to you, because as you said a moment ago, you won a squeaker of an election. And we have actually talked about in class very recently how hard it is to defeat incumbents, even on a state level. So how does it feel? First of all, a question from Gage Gunter. How does it feel to know that you flipped a House seat? And what was the suspense like having a recount and then, of course, getting the victory?
You know, if I could sum up how it feels in one word, I would say grateful. I will always 100% of the time give all the credit to my team of volunteers and everybody who helped me. We had such an excitement and enthusiasm and momentum on my campaign, and I would not be here without my team that surrounded me. One of my interns I know was involved. His name's Garrett. He was involved in your guys' organization. So I always want to give him a shout out, but that is overwhelmingly, I just feel thankful. Of course, I feel thankful to the people in the 135th who took a risk on me. We had an incumbent who had served in office for several terms, and it is hard to unseat an incumbent because that person obviously has name recognition and been in the district for a long time. But I think my message resonated with people, and I know that I'm not somebody who has a background in the political world, and I'll tell you now, I will never run for any other office. My goal was to serve as state representative for as long as my district wanted me to, and then I want to get back to public health because that's also where my passion lies. But I just feel incredibly grateful every day I get to walk into this building and represent the people of the 135th. In terms of how it felt on election night to know that I didn't have the results. Oh gosh, I mean, I'm sure you guys can imagine, you have this like mental landmark. I just kept telling myself, you just have to get through this many hours and then this many hours. Election day took forever. And then we were at an outdoor watch party. Of course, we had outdoors, and everybody else's results were rolling in. And the Shane Scholler called and let me know, or let Representative Quaid know that my results were not going to be in that night. And so she comes over and tells me, and there's news crews there that are following. And so I have to go announce to everybody, sorry for the anticlimactic day, but we're not going to know the results of the election tonight. But I will applaud Greene County and how transparent they were with the recount process. They invited both me and my incumbent opponent in. I was able to go watch part of the manual recount process. If people talk to you or if you hear the rhetoric about voter fraud or election fraud, I would encourage you to be a part of that process, because to me, it helped me. Any concern or fear I had that there was maybe some ill action or bad actions being taken. I mean, it was the most thorough and planned out and well executed process that I've ever seen in my life. And I have no doubts, and I'm sure everyone else can say that the election was handled in a very fair way. But it was the longest week. And of course, everyone kept calling me and wanting updates, and I didn't have any to give them until about a week later.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. So the election's November 3rd. When do you know you have won? And actually, I don't know, when did you swear in?
So I got sworn in January 6th, but I got a call. It was about 7 days later, and I was just sitting on my couch doing absolutely nothing. I didn't expect the results to come in. And the county clerk called and said, "Hey, we just finished up and you have been officially named the winner." And, I looked around and I'm like, well, there's no party. There's nothing really to do other than I called my parents and my grandparents, and that was pretty much how I celebrated.
I actually do want to bring that up real quick. You got sworn in on January 6th, a day that will stand in American history, not because you got sworn in, but because of what happened in Washington, D.C. Would you like to share some thoughts about what it was like to witness what happened on that day?
Absolutely. That was a tough day for all of us as Americans. That was a tough day. It was one of the most surreal experiences of my life to be sitting on the House floor of the chamber in the capital of Missouri, surrounded by all this beauty and democracy and all the wonderful things that we do in this building, and getting sworn in this pivotal moment, at least of my life. This is, the most important work I've ever done. And all of a sudden, people start getting alerts on their phones. I had my phone silent and on my desk. But one of my Republican colleagues leaned over and said, "Oh my gosh, do you know what's happening?" And I said, "No, I don't know." And she said, "They're evacuating Pelosi's office." That's what she shared. She was like, "They just left, like the computers are up and people are breaking in." And so we were all trying to focus on our swearing in ceremony. But of course, in 2021, everybody has their phones out and is updating people. And then there's a lot of kind of rumors that are circulating about the safety and security of our building where we are. I will share that everything in Jeff City was very calm, very peaceful. We did have some protesters here on grounds, but nothing concerning. It was all very democratic. But it was just one of those kind of out-of-body experiences where we were here to be celebrating all of us entering into this important part of democracy. And then we had on the background all of this terrible stuff happening in Washington, D.C. So it was definitely an out-of-body experience.
Crazy day for you, especially, I'm sure. Yeah. Officially got sworn in, and what happened in D.C. just absolutely crazy. I do want to ask, feel free to skip over this answer. You don't have to divulge any information, but have you guys been okay security-wise? Should we anticipate you guys will be okay security-wise? Like, how worried should we be about your safety?
So I of course, and just speaking from my own perspective, I have felt nothing but safe in this building. We've been getting briefs from Capitol Police. We have on-site highway patrol that have been, oftentimes I look out my window and I see them out making their rounds. So I have never been worried about myself or my colleagues' safety or security, other than we had a random fire alarm 2 nights ago, but that was unrelated. I don't know what information Capitol Police is getting. Of course, all of that's private information. I know that there were some concerns of inauguration week at the presidential level, and we ended up not coming back for session that week. I think in large part because several of our members tested positive for COVID, but there was speculation that some of it had been because there were credible threats to our safety. But of course, that information needs to stay protected, so we're not privy to it. But in my experiences in this building, it is a warm and welcoming place full of great people keeping us safe, and I have never felt anything but safe here.
Representative, first of all, I just want to say again, thank you for taking time to speak with us. If it's okay, I'd like to hit you with a couple more questions. We got about a few more minutes left together. First of all, A question that's really has been interesting consistently to traditional students has been the smoking age. It has been raised here in Springfield. I know that's local, not statewide, but it's been raised to 21. You're a public health person. What are your general, but you're also a representative of the people. What are your general thoughts?
So this is maybe going to be an unpopular opinion in the room. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I am in favor of increasing the smoking age to 21. I think, again, this is one of those areas that I yield to the people who are medical experts in their field. There's a lot of data and research to support that health outcomes change when that happens. There's conversation about doing that at the state level, so we'll see what happens. I know Springfield was kind of on the front end of that. Other municipalities have done it as well. But I would encourage you, this is where I'm going to challenge you guys. If there are people in that room that heard me with that answer and are mad or upset, then do something about it. Contact your state representatives. If legislation starts moving to make that a statewide mandate, then have those conversations with your elected officials to make sure that your voice is heard, because that's one of those things that impacts probably the people in this room more so than it does me. And it's our obligation, of course, as constituents to make sure that we're expressing our thoughts to our state and elected officials.
What are your thoughts on related products that are still very new, such as Juuls?
So I'll be really honest with you guys. That's an area that we haven't talked about a ton here in Jeff City, nor that I hear about from constituents. So I'd probably need to do some research before I made any statements about what I would want to see happen at a legislative or policy level. Of course, again, from a generic comment, I'm going to say I'm always going to prioritize public health over other things, but also fully recognize that within that are individual liberties and individual choices, which should be celebrated and honored. So I think as someone who doesn't know a ton about Juuls, I'd probably need to do a little bit of research before I spoke to it.
Sure. Let's end this on the fun topic of reproductive rights. Always a very easygoing topic, right? Generally speaking, where do you fall on reproductive rights? And again, it's unfair to ask you to do that in 1 or 2 minutes, but go ahead.
Yeah, so, I will sum that up in one sentence. A woman's body and what happens to a woman's body should be a decision made between her and her healthcare provider. That is going to be my answer regarding anything related to healthcare, including reproductive rights, because I think that healthcare provider-patient relationship is one of the most important relationships and why I talk so much about healthcare services. So to sum it all up in a nutshell, that would be my response. Of course, there are so many layers and so many things that we could talk about. And I also think it's very important to acknowledge that reproductive rights doesn't just mean, are you pro-choice or pro-life in those simple terms. But of course, within that, making sure that birth control is affordable and accessible to all, making sure that we have education in public schools, in the schools in general, that help people make those decisions, and that we are informed. So I think that there's so many things. It's a very complex issue, but in a 1 minute answer, that would be my answer.
All right, it's unfair to ask you to weigh in on that in a minute. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions or anything you'd like her to weigh in on before we say thank you? Go ahead, yeah.
I just had a few questions about, I don't know if you know much about like prison reform. Do you know much about that? Okay, I have a meeting with the chief of police next month over a few cases, and I just kind of want to know your thought process on what you think about our prison system.
That's a great question. I actually met yesterday with the Department of Corrections at the state level to ask some of those specific questions, and then have a follow-up meeting in March with our state jail in Greene County. I think, there are a lot of things that we could talk about, and if you wanted, I would welcome anybody to get my email address and send me specific questions. We can take this offline. So something I learned this week, and I think this is a atrocity to our state, is that we have wait lists for our public defenders. And of course, that's kind of at the crux of the criminal justice system. So there are people in the state of Missouri who aren't getting assigned a public defender because we don't have enough. And that was in the budget request from the department to be able to hire additional public defenders because their cases are so high. And we've actually had lawsuits in our state happen because we don't have enough public defenders. And of course, the Sixth Amendment tells us that everyone has the right to a fair in speedy trial and right to legal counsel. So that's one part of it that I think is very important. To your point, in meeting with a police officer, my line of questioning would be around what are we doing with the body cams that have been rolled out? What have we seen successes? Have we seen weaknesses? What else can we be doing? I would be asking questions about, of course, diversity training. What are the minority representation of our police force? What are we doing to increase that? Of course, we want all groups of people that are governing our state or that are having an influence in our community to be representative of the people that live there. So what pathways are we creating for individuals to become a part of the police force if they so want? And then, so I think those would be some of the questions that I would ask if I was meeting with Chief Williams.
Representative, we have a question from Carrie. Did you have a thought, Carrie?
No.
Okay, sure. Alexa, did you have anything you want to follow up with?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, Representative, thank you so much for spending your time with us. Round of applause, yay! We'll share this video later on and I'll make it available for you. What's the best way to reach you if I am interested in contacting you?
Yes, so please guys, number one, of course, social media. I'm on all the social media platforms. You can find me there and I'm very responsive to that. If you want to email me formally, you can reach me at betsy.fogle@house.mo.gov. So betsy.fogle@house.mo.gov. That is my House email. I always tell people, remember that is sunshineable. So anything that you write to me in an email on the House website could be pulled. So I never want anyone to send sensitive information and not know that. But please reach out. I love if you agree with me, if you disagree with me, especially if you live in or near the 135th. I want to know your thoughts on everything. You'd be surprised how much legislation moves through my office without a single person reaching out and telling me their thoughts on it. That makes it difficult for me to do my job when I don't know what the people of Springfield want. So use my office, use me, and I hope to hear from all of you.
Thank you so much, Representative, and you have a great day.
Thank you guys. Have a great day.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for being respectful for our guests. Obviously, we have been visited by an elected state representative that represents part of Springfield, representing the Democratic Party. On Friday, we'll be visited by her Republican counterpart, who represents another part of Springfield. We'll be answering several other of your questions. And of course, he himself will also be given many of the same questions we just asked her, so we can see the contrast between the two political parties. As far as work over the next couple days, there doesn't need to be any, but please, once again, we do have, I think we have 3 or 4 people that have yet completed their congressional committee paper. Get that done. Don't get a 0 out of 20. Don't dig yourself into a hole you don't need to be in. So please get that turned in over the next couple of days. It's late. It's better than nothing. And you can anticipate a similar assignment as well. Now, in the back, can you raise your hand, please, ma'am, one more time? Right here. Yeah. Where she is sitting, please make sure your papers are there as you leave. And I'll see you here Friday. Thank you very much.